All right, so what we're doing today, square root property and completing the square. We've already talked about completing the square or square root property a little bit, so that's not going to be a big deal. Now we're going to actually do a little something different with it later on to show you some parts of it. But we're going to start with what we know, and then show you completing the square. It's another option you can do. It's not a great option to me, in my mind, but we'll at least show it to you, so at least you've kind of seen it because we have to at least show it to you. So, all right. So very first one is square root property. And again, we've talked about this one a little bit already, so hopefully it's not any big deal. This is what you want to use when there is no B term. And what we said we would do is basically just two things. Step one, you would get the x squared by itself. And then step two, you square root both sides. Okay, so really straightforward. There wasn't anything really weird on this one when it came down to it. Again, we've looked at a few examples of it. So if we had x squared equals 49, again, if it tells you to use the square root property to solve it, well, then you would just square root both sides. And then we said the one thing is that when you do this one, when you square root 49, you've got 7, but you've also got -7 that the answer could be. And again, with Math Excel, sometimes they'll let you use the plus or minus button. Sometimes they don't. It just depends on, I guess, kind of what mood they're in. So either one of those two would be okay. Okay. Now here's one where, again, you wouldn't necessarily, again, just kind of getting what your thought process on this one is. If you got one like this, you may just look at it and go, well, what I really have to do the square root property, because that's already a difference of two perfect squares. Couldn't I just take this thing and break it up as x plus 9 and x minus 9 equal to 0? And that way I know the answer is going to be positive and -9. Yeah, you can. But if you technically, are solving it by the square root property, you would square root, you get the x squared by itself, which means we just add the 81 to both sides, and then you would square root both sides. And then you get the plus or minus 9. So, I mean, really, you can go either route. If they've already got it set up where it's a difference of two perfect squares, you could think that it's just, x plus 9, x minus 9, you've got your two answers here. Or if you go ahead and move it over and then square root both sides, you still get the plus or minus 9. So, really, either way you go in that case is fine. All right, now where it becomes a little bit more, I guess, obvious when you're doing some of these, where it comes in a little bit more handy, is when you have some that's more like this. If you've got 2x squared equals 50. And then in that case, if you're going to get the x squared by itself, very first thing you would do is divide both sides by 2. So you got x squared equal to 25. And then hopefully once you're there, then you realize, okay, if I square root both sides, then I'm just going to get plus or minus 5. Okay. And then last couple ones we've got here. Because all these have been perfect square roots. Just remember that sometimes when you do these, you're not going to get a perfect square root. You're going to have to work on breaking it down, simplifying a little bit. If you've got 3x squared equals 60, divide both sides by 3. Got x squared equals 20. So when you square root both sides, we've got the square root of 20. It's not a perfect square. So if you start to break it down, that's one where, again, if I'm thinking 20, that's one of those where I can already think of a perfect square number because it's 4 times 5. That way you've got square root of 4, which is just 2, and then the 5 would stay on the inside. Okay, so again, you may get a perfect square root. You may get one that's not a perfect square root. Either way you go, you just break it down as much as you can when it comes off of it. Okay, and then one more. If you've got x squared plus 9 equals 0. Again, get it so you've got the x squared by itself. So you've got x squared would equal -9. And then square root both sides. And again, if it was square root of 9, it would be 3. But because of the negative, just make sure you put the I in there so that you can see then it's plus or minus 3i. All right, again, is it a real answer? No, but it's still, and they should hopefully in that case kind of specify if they want real or imaginary or either or. So it should kind of at least lead you in the right direction. Okay, and again, we already talked about doing square root property. I think some people talked about doing that along the way, but that's officially what the square root property is, that you get the x squared term by itself, you square root both sides, and then whatever answer you get, whether it's a imaginary number, a radical or whole number, you break it down and just work it out as much as you can from there. Okay, but pretty straightforward. Not really a whole lot of weird stuff you can do with that one. Okay, now the last one we've got, the other option we've got, which is completing the square. This is one that's, to me, of all the things that we have to do with when we're solving and doing all these things, it's probably the least helpful. All right, and we're going to kind of start with a baby step of it here, and then in a minute. So this is actually completing the square. In a minute, we'll show you one where we're going to solve by completing the square, and just kind of let you see how that's going to work and what it could go through those. So when you're completing the square, here's the big thing for this part of it, is that you're going to find the C term. So again, we're still talking about ax squared plus bx plus c. So this is one of those things where they're basically going to leave off the c term. They're going to give you ax squared plus bx, and then we're going to figure out what this c term is going to be. And we're actually going to look at it where the a term is going to be 1, because it will make this a little bit easier. If the a term is not 1, then it gets a little bit tougher when it comes off of it. Okay. So it's basically just a two-step process. If we're looking at something like this, where they give you ax squared plus bx, they're going to ask you to find the c term. To complete the square, all you're going to do is you're going to take the b term you have and divide it by 2. And then step 2, you're going to square the b divided by 2. Which basically means that the c term is always going to be b over 2 squared. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to basically give you a problem where we're going to ask you just to find the number that would complete the square. Okay, so they may give it to you like this. Sometimes they may give it to you like this. But either way they go, basically you've got something squared plus or minus some number that's here. All right, so step one, pretty straightforward. Just take the b term and divide it by 2, which is 12. And then step 2, you take 12 and you square it. And you may be thinking, what else do we do? That's it. That's all you have to do. Okay, now here's what they're really kind of getting you ready for, is that if you're getting, why they call this completing the square, is that, and this is kind of like just, side note here, what we got. That if you did take this 144 and plugged it in, is that okay? That's a perfect square number, because 144 is 12 times 12, right? Here's why they call that completing the square, and here's kind of what they're looking at, is that the factors of 144 that would equal 24 would be 12 and 12, right? So what they're trying to get you to see is that if you do this thing, it'd be m plus 12 times m plus 12 if you factored it, which would really be m plus 12 squared. And so that's the completing the square part, is now that you've got something squared. And they're like, oh, well, if you do that, well, then it's really easy to graph this thing because now you've got the x value of the vertex. Okay, but I would rather just do the negative b over 2a and make it just as easy from that part of it. So to me, it's another way to find the vertex, but it's a really long, complicated way, especially if this first number is not 1 back here. It changes the whole thing on this one. But for what we're going to do for now, we just have to show it to you to make sure everybody's okay with it. All right, and it doesn't matter if that middle number is negative. If it's x squared minus 18x, you still take the b term and divide it by 2, which is negative 9. And then step 2, you just take the negative 9 and then you square it to get 81. Okay, and again, the whole purpose of them having you find out what this c term is that if you factor this thing off, then it would be x minus 9 and x minus 9, or x minus 9 squared. Okay, again, that's more like a side note that we don't have to worry about for this problem. But in a minute, when they ask you to solve by completing the square, that's kind of what we're going to do. Okay, and again, that's the whole purpose of that one. That's why they call it completing the square, is that when you get finished with it, you've got a squared factored expression that we're going to get from. Now, if they ask you just to find the c value, don't worry about this part, and just tell me that that's going to be 81. If it happens to be a fraction, that's okay. Sometimes the numbers come out to be fractions. If there are fractions, that's not a big deal. Okay, and then the last two things we're going to do is they're going to ask you to solve by doing those two things, and we'll show you a couple of problems here where it's a little bit different than the first ones that we looked at. Okay, so for this one, they're going to ask you to solve by the square root property. Okay, we'll show you this one of what you can do. We'll also show you a different way you could do this one. That if if it's ACT questions, because again, we're looking at y'all taking for juniors taking ACT in about 6 weeks, month and a half. That even if they tell you to solve by square root property, as long as you can find the answer, it doesn't matter how you find the answer. It's just being able to find the answer when it comes up. Okay, but technically, if I do this one, if they want you to use the square root property, what are the factors? Because if we try to take the square root of this whole thing, it's not going to work. But what are the factors of 25 that equal 10? 5 and 5, right? Yeah. And that being negative in the middle, that'd be basically x minus 5 and x minus 5, right? Which means that would be x minus 5 squared. Okay, and as long as it's something squared, doesn't matter that there's an extra 5 what's on the inside of it. As long as you've got something squared, then you can square root both sides. All right, so we do x minus 5 squared. The square root and the square cancel each other out, leaves us with just x minus 5. Square root of 81 is 9, but remember, it's positive or negative 9. Because you go to 9 times 9, you also go do negative 9 times negative 9. All right, which means when we get the answer for this one, we got two things we have to worry about. We've got to do x minus 5 equals negative 9. But we've got x minus 5 equals positive 9. So we'll add 5 here. So x would equal negative 4. And then add 5 here. So x would equal 14. Okay, because the other thing you could have done, let's say you get on one of these and it tells you to do the square root property and you kind of blank out for a second. What a lot of people would do, and I would probably even kind of do this one myself if I was kind of working through this thing, is if you get to this one and they just say to solve it, probably most people would have subtracted 81 from both sides. Again, this is just a what if here. And then maybe you would say, all right, what about the factors of negative 64 with sum is equal to negative 10? And if you go through your list of factors, and again, we just start with 1 and 64 to make sure we've got the correct numbers with the correct signs. We've got this is negative, so we know that's going to be negative, which means that would be a positive. Check 2 and 32. That's not going to work. We check 4 and wait, is that right? No, it's not 54. Wait, it should be 54, right? Yeah, my bad. Oops, my bad. Right number, wrong signs. That would have been 81. Wait, is that not right? Well, it's 56, isn't it? Yeah, 81 minus 25. I just do it real quick. That's 11. That's 6. Yeah, 56. Okay. I'll get it right here. It is a Monday. Okay, so it's 1 and 56. All right, try that again. So the 56 would still be negative. The 1 would still be positive. Just got to get our numbers correct there. All right, so 2 and 28. 3 doesn't go if you check it with 4. It winds up being 4 and 14. And that's your pair that would add up to be negative 10, which, if you notice here, is the same numbers we've got there. So this would have been x plus 4 and x minus 14. And if you solve this one, you get x equals negative 4. If you solve that one, you get x equals 14. So you get the same answer there that we've got there. It's just a different way of getting to that answer. Okay, and again, if it's ACT, it does this is just all different options of showing you, hey, there's more than one way you can get the answer on these. Some people like having one way. Some people like knowing all the ways. And it honestly just comes down to what you're comfortable with. If you don't like remembering 6 different ways to solve it, and you want to remember like 2, that it's either factor and quadratic formula, I'm good with that, because that's probably what I would do if I was getting ready to take the ACT. I probably would remember that I'm either going to factor it, I'm going to use quadratic formula, because those 2 will get you pretty much everything you're going to do. But if it asks you to do square root property, then that's kind of how you go with it there. All right, let me show you one more of those with square root property. All right, so let's go with 4w squared plus 12w plus 9 equals 49. Okay, and we know we can take the square root of 49, so that's not a problem. It's finding out what this thing would be over here. And again, if you notice, you've got a perfect square here and a perfect square there. They're all pluses. So if we did this the right way, if we want to check it real quick, because 4 would be 2 times 2, 9 would be 3 times 3, and then we just need to check these 2 to make sure it adds up to 12. So 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 2 is 6. If we add those 2 together, we do get 12, so that's our shortcut for this thing. And that's again, that's going back to that perfect square shortcut for factoring that we talked about last week, I think it was. Yeah. If this is a perfect square and that's a perfect square, then you can look for the shortcut. So this thing would be 2w plus 3 squared equals 49. Okay, and now you've got this thing squared, so then we can square root it. All right, which gives us 2w plus 3 equals plus or minus 7. And again, we'll do it both ways here. We'll do one where it equals negative 7, and we'll do another one where it equals positive 7. So working with the negative 7, subtract the 3, and then divide by 2, we get negative 5. Working with the positive 7, subtract 3, divide by 2, we get negative 5 and 2. Okay. Again, you may be asking, well, could I have just moved the 49 over and factored it from there? Yeah, you could have. If you'd factored it, you'd have come back to these same 2 answers and got the same 2 numbers. But again, they're just asking you to use the square root property. All right, and then one more. And again, just have to show you this one. If you don't use this one, that's fine. But it's one of those things where technically we have to show you this one. This will be the last one of the day. They're going to ask you to solve by completing the square. Okay. If you do solve by completing the square, the big catch on this one is you have to get the C term by itself first. And then we'll go back and complete the square like we did the last time. All right. So for this one, just to kind of speed it up a little bit, we're going to go ahead and get the C term by itself. So we've got x squared minus x equals 2. If we had that problem, just show you real quick what it would look like. that the problem would have started off like this, and then we would have added the 2 to both sides. So we'd had x squared minus 6x equals 2. That's worst case scenario where they give everything on one side. If you do that, then you move the 2 over here. Okay, and then from there, we're going to kind of ignore that 2 for just a minute. We're going to do like we did with completing the square. We're going to find the c term. So we're going to take this b term we've got here. We'll take negative 6 and divide it by 2. And we're going to square it. So again, to get that c value that we're looking for, to make it, and again, just kind of forgetting about that one for a minute, we're going to do negative 6 divided by 2, which is negative 3 squared, which is 9. Okay, and here's where this used to throw me off. I remember being in y'all's shoes, and this is where I would get stuck, because they were like, okay, we move the c term over, we got it. We've got the 9 here. Got it. And I'm going to take this 9 that's here, and there's our completing the square, so we can get the c term, so we've got this nice perfect square over here. But because it's an equation, it already equaled 2. We're also, if we add 9 to the left side, because it's an equation, you've also got to add 9 to the right-hand side. And that used to throw me off when I was in y'all's shoes, because I was like, I understood completing the square to get this, but because I already had this 2 that was over here, then I always would forget to add that 9 on both sides. And then finally somebody told me later, like, you don't have to do that. You could just do the quadratic formula and find the answer. I'm like, well, that would make life a lot easier. How come they didn't tell me that back then? All right, so on that one, factors of 9 that equals 6 is going to be 3 and 3. So it's x minus 3 squared. 2 plus 9 is 11. And then we're going to square root both sides. Okay, and again, for this one, the square and square root cancel each other out, leaves you with x minus 3. You cannot simplify square root 11 because it's a prime number. It won't go down. So it's just going to be plus or minus 11. And then the only other thing we can do to solve this one is we're going to add 3 to both sides. So then x would equal 3 plus or minus square root of 11. Which again is the exact same answer that we would have gotten if we had taken these values for A, B, and C and plugged it into the quadratic formula and gotten the same answer. It was just a different way of getting to the answer.